I went from thinking that whiskey tastes like nail polish remover to being a full-time whiskey content creator in the span of a few years. So I can tell you that if there's a trick in the book to develop your palate, I have tried it. So I can confidently say if you follow the steps that we're about to talk about, it is your best chance at developing your palate for tasting whiskey. Now, before we get too in-depth, there are a few things to avoid if you're having trouble tasting notes. These could be one of the culprits. The first is going to be eating too spicy of food because it's going to overstimulate your palate. The second would be eating too stimulating of food in general. Lots of salt, lots of pepper, sour candy. Think things that make you salivate a lot. And then the third is going to be most types of smoking. I enjoy the occasional cigar, but I notice if I have too many cigars, my palate definitely gets a little bit worse. And then, of course, if you're smoking cigarettes very regularly, that does make food taste not as good. So of course it's going to have the same effect on whiskey. The first thing that you need to know about developing your palate is that it's going to happen in stages. The first step is you just got to get to where it doesn't taste like pain. It doesn't hurt every time you take a sip of whiskey. Then you got to get to the point where you can notice differences between majorly different types of whiskey. Maybe they still don't taste like much, but at least they taste different. Then you'll get to a point where you can taste a whiskey and you're like, this either tastes good or bad. That's a good point to be at. After you get from there to the next step, you're going to start noticing subtle differences in whiskeys. You're going to be like, okay, I can see how this one has this, whereas this one's kind of similar, but it's got a little something different going on. And then finally, after you get through all of that, you should be able to taste a whiskey and be like, this has these notes in it. And that's kind of the final stage. That last stage you can just continue to develop. Now notice that out of all those phases, most of them are comparative. Even the first step, just getting it to not taste like pain, is a lot easier if you're comparing different whiskeys. So I always recommend you start off with two whiskeys that are very different, maybe a bourbon and a scotch, and you taste them side by side. Don't be afraid to use a spittoon and spit it out so that you're not getting too intoxicated and you can actually focus, but do those side-by-side tastings. This is a good point to pause and tell you, don't break the bank. This is not the time, if you're just learning to develop your palate, it's not the time to go buying the super expensive stuff. Start off, I think the $20 to $35 range is like the magic point where you're gonna get whiskeys that are at least noticeably different in flavor, but they're not going to be overly expensive. And that's a perfect spot to be in, because then when you figure out what you like more or less than each other, then take the ones that you like more and go get the little bit nicer bottle. But start off in that $20 to $35 price range and figure out what you like. So where we're at so far is just taking two very different whiskeys in that $20 to $35 price range, trying them side by side until you can tell that there's a big difference between them. And once you get to where they are noticeably different, pick the one that you liked more and get more and more similar. So if you liked the bourbon more, now switch to a high-rye bourbon versus a wheated bourbon and get more and more similar. But if you really want to take it to the next level, I find that it is the most helpful to use blind tastings. And if you want some ideas of specific tastings that you should do, stick around to the end or skip to the end. I'm going to list off different tastings that I would personally do as palate workouts to really get that development. Now I'm going to break down the two different types of blind tastings and why you'd want to do one over the other. But first, I have to tell you to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content, and ring that notification bell. And hey, if you have a tip for developing your palate that you like more than what I said here, make sure you comment it below so that everybody watching can try it. So as I mentioned, there are two different types of blind tastings. The first is a double blind tasting. What this means is you have no idea what you're tasting. So it's not like you have a few different whiskeys and you don't know which is which. This is, you might know the category, like bourbon, but you don't know anything other than that. You just know that you've got, let's say, 4 bourbons in front of you. Now, this is obviously the hardest one to do, but it is the best for developing your palate because you have no idea what you're tasting, so you have to take intense notes. You obviously can't be biased. You don't even know what it is that you're tasting. And then when you reveal what it is, you've got these notes and you're like, this is what I think this wheated bourbon tastes like. Here's why I liked it or didn't like it. And that is the best, least biased way to develop your palate. Now, of course, like I said, it's really hard to do on your own. You could get a big selection of whiskey and then have someone pick a bottle or two for you and pour it without you seeing what it is. Or there are some subscription services for it. I personally have worked with Blind Barrels in the past, so I'll throw my affiliate link down in the description. There are a couple other services for it, but I really like Blind Barrels the best. Now, the next method is significantly easier to do, and in my opinion, it's just about as good for developing your palate. I do these all the time, and that is a single blind tasting. The only difference between single blind and double blind is with a single blind, you know what 2 or 3 or 4 whiskeys it is that you're tasting. You just don't know which is which. You've had them scrambled up. And this method can be great for trying to figure out the best blank. Insert thing here. If you want to know the best bourbon under $20, pick your top 4 and then do a single blind tasting of them, and that's going to tell you, in your opinion, which is the best bourbon under $20. There's a few different ways that you can pull this off at home. So the first would be, you could just write like A and B on a glass, and then you could have somebody else pour them for you and write on a little piece of paper, A is this whiskey, B is that whiskey. Fold it up and give it to you. You do your tasting, and then you reveal which is which. You could also, if you're by yourself, you could take a tiny little slip of paper, write what it is, put it on the bottom of the glass, and then kind of close your eyes and scramble them and hope for the best. That one's a little bit more difficult because it's hard to lose focus on which is which, but if you have 3 or 4, maybe it's not too hard to lose track of them. And then of course there are a couple of products developed to help with single blind tastings. The first that I had ever heard of was the Great Whiskey Challenge, which I think works well. There's also the Solo Blind that I have to shout out. I have one right over there because it is the product that I actually developed with my business partner. But I'm not here to sell that to you. You can also accomplish this at home with an assistant or with some slips of paper. So now you're an expert on side-by-side tastings and blind tastings. What specific tastings should you do? So there are 3 that I would recommend to beginners. I already mentioned bourbon versus scotch. Those are 2 extremely different whiskey categories that if whiskey to you just tastes like grain alcohol, try those side by side and I think you'll see the difference. The next blind tasting that I would recommend would be getting more specific in the bourbon category because I come from a bourbon-based background. High-rye bourbon versus wheated bourbon. You could use like a 4 Roses for your high-rye and you could use Larceny as your wheated bourbon, but there are tons of options out there. I also actually really like Green River has a bourbon, which actually has a lot of rye in it, 21% rye, and then they have a wheated bourbon where they literally keep everything the same. They take that rye out and they put wheat in instead, which is a really good comparison for high-rye versus wheated. And the last one that I think still falls a little bit into beginner territory is I would use blind tastings to learn about finishes. So you could take Woodford Reserve versus Woodford Reserve Double Oaked. You could take Elijah Craig versus Elijah Craig Toasted Barrel. You could go to almost any distillery that does finishing, take their standard bottle, and then take their finished bottle. A lot of distilleries will offer a bourbon, and they'll offer a bourbon finished in a wine cask. Take those 2 and compare them, and you're going to see what those different finishes do to the flavor. And then there are a few slightly more advanced blind tastings that I would recommend if you're getting good at telling the differences. So the first that I already mentioned is doing the best blank under blank, the best bourbon under $50. Pick your top 5 from a specific category. Maybe it's bourbon, maybe it's something double oaked, maybe it's types of scotch. Pick your top ones, try them side by side. You're going to learn not only a ton about that category of whiskey, but you're going to learn a ton about what gentle, real subtle differences can cause you to really like one or the other more. Then the next one that I would say is even more advanced than that will be trying different batches of the same whiskey next to each other or different barrels of the same single barrel next to each other. So any whiskey that's got single barrel in the name, what that means is that bottle came from a specific barrel. They didn't blend multiple barrels together. So if you can get 2 bottles of that same whiskey from different barrels or 2 bottles of a batch whiskey from 2 different batches, some companies will just tell you this is batch 5, this is batch 6. Try those next to each other and see if you can tell the subtle differences that it has between it. The last one that I would recommend that's getting into pretty advanced territory, something that I have recently taken on as a hobby that I think is a ton of fun, is home blending. So take 2 whiskeys that you think this one has banana and this one has cinnamon. I think together these are going to be like Bananas Foster. Put them together and then do a blind tasting. Bourbon 1, Bourbon 2, blend of both bourbons. Which do you like the most? This one can be a ton of fun because you're constantly trying to beat the other two. You're trying to come up with something that tastes better than the sum of its parts. The possibilities are basically endless, and by the time you do a few different handfuls of blind tastings, you should get pretty good at telling the differences and pulling out those specific flavor notes. If you enjoyed this content, check out the Patreon down in the description for even more content before you leave this video.